And welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, and answering your questions tonight, political commentator Piers Akerman, United Nations Youth Representative Samah Hadid, Shadow Communications Minister Malcolm Turnbull, Assistant Treasurer Bill Shorten, and author and comedian Gretel Killeen. Please welcome our panel. OK, well, Q&A is live from 9:35 Eastern Daylight Savings Time and simulcast on ABC News 24, Australian Network and News Radio. And you can go to our website to send your questions in and join the Twitter conversation using the hashtag that's just appearing on your screen right now. Well, our first question tonight comes from Mark Hayes.
Good evening. With the announcement by Julia that there would now be a carbon tax, and Christine Milne boasting it's happening because we have shared power in Australia. My question to the panel is, who do you believe is running the country? Since Bob Brown is calling the shots, should he just officially be declared Prime Minister?
Let's start with Piers Akerman. Sounds like it might have been written for you, though.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Tony. Well, I always thought during the run-up to the last election that a vote for the Greens was a vote for Labor anyway, and now we're just seeing the obvious evidence. I think the fact that Julia lied so comprehensively in the week before the election about there being no carbon tax, that she wouldn't lead a government of which was going to introduce a carbon tax and so forth, and the fact that she was obviously doing a deal with the Greens in advance of the election just proves how morally bankrupt the current Australian government is. I don't think I've ever seen worse.
How do you feel about this Alan Jones coined phrase, Julia?
I don't think that he coined it because a lot of readers have been sending that to me in emails before Jones mentioned it in his very stormy interview last Friday, I think, Tony.
So did it sound faintly anti-Semitic on radio?
No, that didn't resonate in my ear in that way.
Malcolm Turnbull, you went, at that point.
No, I was just saying, I think that's a bit of a long bow. Look, the reality is, whatever you think about policies, Julia Gillard unequivocally said the day before the election there will not be a carbon tax. She gave that pledge knowing and expecting people to rely on it when they went to vote. And now she's introducing a carbon tax. So she has broken her word comprehensively. And I can't think of, I agree with Piers, this is the worst government I've ever known, but I cannot think also of a government that has so blatantly broken a promise in the way this one has. This is extraordinary, really.
Didn't Tony Abbott redefine the whole concept of truth in politics with his remarks suggesting that you should only take as gospel the things that he says which are scripted?
Julia Gillard's pledge not to have a carbon tax was given in writing, on radio and on television. There is no form of media that she missed. She wanted to make sure that everybody knew there would be no carbon tax if you voted Labor. So, presumably, a lot of people relied on that, voted Labor, and they are getting a carbon tax. Now, that is a breach of faith. And what she should do, she's honour bound to do, if she wants to have a carbon tax, go back to the people and ask for a fresh mandate.
OK, let's hear from Bill Shorten on that.
Well, first of all, when Julia Gillard went to the election, she made it very clear that she wanted to see a price on carbon. She made it very clear that Labor wanted to tackle climate change, that in the first term, despite, to be fair, Malcolm Turnbull's best efforts, the Liberal Party reneged on a deal and we weren't able to get up through the Senate the proposition that we were advancing on acting on climate change. At the election, let's be clear, Labor didn't win unilaterally. With the circumstance of not having a majority, an absolute majority in the House of Representatives, then what you've got to do is you can either look at the roadblock of not having an absolute majority and you can say, well, because we don't have an absolute majority, let's give up on climate change. But Julia Gillard's made of sterner stuff than that. Julia understands that we've got to have work done on climate change, that we should set a price on carbon, because after all, despite what I have to say, I respect Malcolm Turnbull in terms of his actions on climate change, but we sit every day in Parliament opposite a Liberal Party who, by and large, don't believe that climate change is real, And Julia Gillard is determined not to be defeated in terms of getting work done, real action on climate change, and that's what she'll do.
A quick question on that. Does not having an absolute majority mean you don't have to keep your word?
Not at all. What it means is that you've got to be able to, when you have roadblocks and if you're driving from A to B, A is where we're at and B is where we want the country to be in terms of setting a price on carbon, investing for the future, reducing carbon pollution. I mean, after all, for the last 34 years, we've seen the Earth, its warmest temperatures ever recorded, and she's determined that we act on it. Do you simply give up at the first hurdle? Do you simply say climate change is too hard because Tony Abbott believes that the science is crap? I think not.
Bill, if the first hurdle is a promise, you just leap straight over it.
Not at all. What we're saying is that the people spoke in the election. That's a pretty big event. And when people indicate that, I believe people indicated they wanted action on climate change, but they picked a range of MPs to represent them, I think you're arrogant not to listen to the election result.
Gretel Killeen.
Well, with all due respect to the brouhaha about whether it was a lie or not, for we, the general public, we're really not surprised to hear a politician lie. Would you agree? The more astounding thing about this situation is how stupidly it has been done. There was no catalyst to cause this announcement to be made. It's not as though we suddenly got new figures on global warming. Let's come in with our tax. It came out of the blue. And when I say out of the blue, after 5 days of us being shattered in sharing the New Zealand earthquake trauma, Egypt, Libya, another boy dying in Afghanistan, we were preoccupied with other issues. This one came in for no apparent reason. Not only did it come in, it came in unprepared. We didn't even get any facts. So to me, it's not so much that someone has lied, it's why the hell did you all do it so stupidly?
I know that everyone wants to leap in at this point. We're going to hear from Samah Hadid because I want to hear from all the panellists first. Please.
Well, frankly, the fact is we've been preparing for this since 2007. There has been a mandate given by the Australian people to the Labor government to actually take strong action on climate change. This isn't new. It's not as if suddenly we're hearing about climate change and a price on carbon for the first time. You know, this has been in the public domain for very long. And frankly, I don't think Tony Abbott can make these charges of inconsistency. I mean, he's not in a position to do so. And frankly, I prefer not to squabble over charges of inconsistency and backflips when both political major parties are guilty of it in the first place. I prefer to maybe focus on the future ahead, to first and foremost, finally work towards a clean energy future and a low-carbon economy. This is an opportunity that we have missed out on because of this politics of fear and scaremongering campaigns which have been launched. And they do nothing to our national interests. So maybe I'd hope that the discussion would focus finally on this opportunity.
OK, let's just hear from Malcolm Turnbull on that issue. I mean, do you find a lot to disagree with there?
No, look, I agree with Samah that we should be working towards a clean energy future. And there are various ways of doing that.
And a price on carbon.
Yes, I think there should be a price on carbon. But there are various ways of doing this. A tax is one, an emissions trading scheme is another. The coalition's policy of the government spending money to put a price on carbon with taxpayers' dollars is another way. There are many other techniques. What the Prime Minister did, and there can be no doubt about this, is she said, I want to put a price on carbon, but there is one route that I absolutely will not take, and that is having a carbon tax. So she took that option off the table, and people relied on that and voted for on the basis of it. Now, she cannot, after the election, put that back on. She could have a direct action approach, like the coalition is proposing. She could, in fact, consistent with her policies, have an emissions trading scheme. But what she has gone for is the very way of putting a price on carbon that she said she would not take.
Okay.
And I think, if I can just finish, Tony, yes, the issue here is one of character more than policy. Yeah. That is what it's all about. I mean, Kevin Rudd lost popular support because when he walked away from the emissions trading scheme, he was seen to be a man of no conviction, to have no character. And what she has done is said to the Australian people, I promise that if you elect me to government, I will do this, I will not do this, and i.e. put on a carbon tax, and then she's doing it. And that is an incredible breach of faith.
All right. I'm just going to get a response from Bill Shorten on that, and then we'll move to our next question.
Just in terms of this debate about what the government should do since the election, and I listened very carefully to what Gretel had to say about this has come as a surprise, especially following the earthquake. I actually think that the climate change debate, on balance, is not a surprise. Then we have, because there has been talk, if only Malcolm had been able to win his way within the Liberal Party, and he only lost, to be fair to you, by one vote. By one vote did you lose. I think we lost
one vote is a landslide.
Oh, just clearly, as we found out. But the point about it is, and you know, I think your good humour reflects that you've tried your hardest and at least you've got a clear conscience. What I would say, though, with all of that is this. Climate change is not a new problem. There's been too much inaction. Julia Gillard and Labor went to the last election with a set of policies. However, the election result, as people remember, was inconclusive for 17 days. No one was sure who was going to do what. We saw both parties negotiating with the crossbenchers. So fair's fair. Tony Windsor, who's an independent up in New England, he made it clear that he understands that the circumstances did change. And so he's made it clear, just you said that it was a bit of a surprise to everyone. I'm saying there has been a lot of debate on this question. What matters, to my way of thinking, is that we actually do have policies to tackle carbon pollution. Mr Turnbull said there's a range of ways to do it, but you can't escape setting a price, and we've made it clear we want to get to an emissions trading system, which was his preferred model. Industry's made it clear they want to have a clear price. Julia Gillard's giving the leadership which this country has not been able to successfully drive through in terms of climate change.
All right, there are plenty of aspects to this issue. We're going to go to our next question, which is on the issue as well. It's from Eamon Waterford.
My question's to Malcolm Turnbull. In 2010, you stated that Tony Abbott's carbon reduction plan was a recipe for fiscal recklessness on a grand scale. Do you stand by your principles now, or do you now support his people's revolt against a price on carbon?
Well, you know, we'll see about the people's revolt, but I think there is a people's revolt.
You doubt it?
Just hang on. I don't think there's a people's revolt so much about putting a price on carbon. I think there is a people's revolt about being conned and being lied to by the Prime Minister. That's what people are revolted by, frankly. OK,
let's go to the question, though. And while we're on the subject, I'll quote something else you wrote a little before that. The Liberal Party is currently led by people whose conviction on climate change is that it's crap and you don't need to do anything about it.
Well, I think
do you still believe that?
No, I think, well, I mean, Tony's on the record with a number of pithy comments, some of them more scatological than others. But the fact is that the coalition, I mean, leaving aside what people's views might be, the coalition's policy is the same as the government's, actually, in this sense, to cut our emissions by 2020 to 95% of 2000 levels. This is the 5% cut. It's actually quite a big cut from business as usual levels, so it shouldn't be. It's much bigger than it sounds. So that's our common commitment. Now, the coalition's policy is one that Tony Abbott argues and Greg Hunt argues, and it's the view, the collective wisdom of the coalition, is one that is more cost-effective and more economically efficient than an emissions trading scheme or indeed a carbon tax.
And do you honestly believe that? And if you do, can you cite one economist who also agrees with that?
Well, I can't cite any economists that agree with it, but I have to say to you that at the moment it's actually the only carbon reduction plan on offer, because what the government has is no plan at all. And I said this at the time of the election. I was honest to my constituents and I said, frankly, I would prefer to put a price on carbon by a market-based mechanism. But the government at the election had no policy, and they still have no policy. We don't know what industries are going to be covered, what the price will be. We really have what compensation will be given to trade-exposed industries. So the government has no policy. At the moment, there is one side of politics with a policy which has the capacity of cutting emissions, albeit through spending taxpayers' dollars, and a government that says it wants to have a carbon tax but doesn't tell you what it's going to cost. I mean, it's just words.
Okay, but
we're grappling with smoke.
We'll go back to our question. I think your question was about the Liberal policy.
Yeah, you previously stated that the Liberal policy was fiscal recklessness. So if you support it now, do you support fiscal recklessness?
Well, look, can I say this to you? any policy which has the government picking winners, in effect, the way the Liberal policy will work if we're elected, is that the government will call for tenders for people, polluters, and to offer cuts in emissions and be paid to do that. And it will call for people to offer offsets, agricultural offsets. There is always a risk when governments are making decisions like that there will be, fiscal waste. That is a risk. That's why Liberals generally prefer market-based mechanisms. But as long as if it is well audited and well run, then there won't be that waste. But that is certainly a risk. You can't deny
very briefly, will it put a price on carbon, which is the essential...
Okay.
How will it do that?
Well, it puts a price on carbon in the sense that it will involve buying hundreds of millions of tonnes of abatement in return for cash coming from the taxpayer's purse, and so that will put a price on it. But the one thing you've got to remember, there is no free lunch in terms of carbon abatement. Someone has to pay. So you either put a price on it through tax or an ETS or something like that, and then the market works out the lowest cost abatement, or the government pays for it, or you have regulations which require people to do certain things, or you have things like solar feed-in tariffs and subsidies. But the point is, someone has to pay, and the objective is to cut emissions in the most cost-effective way. Now, if you're like Piers, my dear friend and constituent, who doesn't believe that climate change is real, then you would say you shouldn't do anything about it.
Anthropological.
Human. Yeah, that's right. Human. You don't think humans have got anything to do with it.
All right, that is a debate we've had many times on this show. I'm going to move to our next question so we can stick to the carbon tax issue. It comes from Mark Smith.
Bill, there are many questions about the carbon tax, what it's going to apply to, petrol, electricity, gas, food, agriculture. As Assistant Treasurer, I'm going to ask you a simple question about the impacts on working families like mine. If I buy a birthday cake from a cake shop after a carbon tax has been introduced, do I pay more or less for that birthday cake?
Well,
you'll pay more.
I don't know how many candles you'll have on your cake. In all seriousness, though, in terms of the design, as our Prime Minister said, as our Minister...
Just say you'll pay more, Bill. You'll pay more. Just say you'll pay more. Tell the truth.
I resisted the temptation to interrupt.
Don't resist the temptation to tell the truth, either. It is you'll pay more. You will. You'll pay more. For sure you will. You have to.
All right, thanks, Malcolm.
Well, it may not be a huge amount more, but you'll pay more.
Thank you again. In terms of the system, we haven't said what is going to be in and not in. There was a debate where Senator Christine Milne... I'll come to your cake in a moment if that's all right. But in terms of...
Everything...
Well, no, to be fair, they haven't said what the design will be yet. What we have said is that we want to set a price and within 3 to 5 years we want to have a smooth transition to a market-traded system, an emissions trading system.
Can I just say, why make the announcement before you figure out the design?
Right. What I will do is, I do accept the need to speed up my answers. OK, the simple thing on cost of living is this. As Mr Turnbull said, as we've said, there's no way you can implement a price on carbon for free. So it will lead to a cost. And that's, I think, the point you're making. You're alluding, obviously, to what John Hewson said when he didn't know the price of a birthday cake with a GST. In terms of, or not a GST, but the forerunner, but we're not quite at that stage yet because we're still working through what's in, what's not in. But you go to, I reckon, the real heart of the matter in what you're saying is cost of living. The real heart of the matter which is being raised, which is fair enough, is there's plenty of pressures on families. There's plenty of pressure in terms of energy prices, petrol prices, cost of living in the supermarkets.
Very hard.
And I get that, and that's the real point here. What the government has said is that we have said that for lower income families there will be compensation. What we've also done, and I think this is important, is this is a government who you just don't look at one issue in isolation. Since 2007, income tax levels have gone down in terms of the rates. What we've also done for people on family tax A and B is we're giving them better benefits. We're also making sure that our pensioners, and we've lifted the disability and the carers pension by $115 a fortnight. That doesn't necessarily make you feel better about your cake, but what I am saying is this is a government who's fully alive to, when we introduce the price on carbon, making sure we calibrate it. The opposition's running a scare campaign, and what they're saying is that a carbon tax is a big blunt instrument. What I'm suggesting is that we'll make it a much more calibrated tax, which will understand the compensation as well as the price.
But Bill, you're Assistant Treasurer. In as much as a carbon tax is not going to reduce the temperature of the planet by any degrees whatsoever, what sort of cost-benefit analysis are you proposing to run on your carbon tax?
In terms of the price...
Cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, no, I heard your question.
They're not big on those, Piers.
Well, you put it with the NBN one.
As much as I hate to interrupt a series of good questions with an answer, what would say about the cost-benefit analysis is this. We know that industry, in order to make investment in important issues like power generation, need to have certainty about what are the policy settings. And as I figured, Piers, because you are consistent, I must say, I figured you'd say, what's the cost-benefit analysis? What I've done is, without boring people to death, I've just got 3 quotes. Origin Energy, they're a pretty big power company. They've said that a switch to lower carbon options in the to drive a switch to lower carbon options in the electricity market, the fundamental requirements are clear. Today's announcement, because it was said last Thursday, is a very positive start. So that's from a power generator. BHP Billiton, who haven't necessarily been our biggest fans courtesy of the minerals rent resource tax, they have said on Thursday, we are pleased government's progressing with a policy to begin the transition to a low carbon future for Australia. Shell, again, haven't been necessarily the biggest fans of the government. They welcome today Anne Pickard, she's the chair. This is the last quote, I promise, Tony.
Well, I hope so, because it looks like you've got a whole page of stuff.
But I just said...
But they're just platitudes, Bill.
Well, sorry, but, OK, Piers, when people don't agree with your worldview, I mean, in our case, it's because, I don't know what, we haven't done our cost-benefit analysis, but when I've got major listed Australian companies offering views, why is everyone who disagrees wrong?
May I just ask, just a fundamental question here. For many of us, this is just blah, blah. And I say that politely. And the reason I say it in this way is because the Labor government has presented this so badly. And it is now, and I use this term loosely, debated in Parliament. It is not being debated at all. There are people calling each other liar with these ridiculous... Sorry, but Tony Abbott's poem was ridiculous. And quoting Shakespeare. We want facts. Calm, sensible facts. But you are going to be in the defence position until the election.
No, I think I can understand that people get frustrated when they watch the coverage of politics. What I would say, though, is we are determined to try and do something about reducing carbon pollution in Australia. And what we're going to do is we're proposing to set a price on carbon and move it to a market trading system. I know people think, oh, blah, blah, blah. What I would say, though, is this is important policy, and you mightn't get any votes for making everyone happy in the first instance. But if we don't do it, we'll be worse off. There's an option. But why don't we ever
Julia just say, straight down the barrel of the camera, I did think this, and now I think that. I know over 5 days the permutations of that have come out. Why are we wasting this time with accusations of lies? Why can't you just own the information?
OK, all right, I'm going to...
I think she'll do that, and I'm sure that by the end of this process, you'll have a more positive view than you do now.
I want to hear from Samah Hadid again. I hear you're sort of groaning and so on from the sidelines, so I'd like to hear what you're thinking during this conversation.
Well, let's just put things in perspective. It's just a framework yet. And, you know, the point of the government putting it out there, and you can correct me here, is for community opinion and views to come to the fore around these issues. Now, the questioner asked about pressures on household, rising electricity prices and whatnot. And these are considerations for the committee, the multi-party committee, to address. And I'd hope that, I'd hope that
that's their choice.
Considerations of compensation prioritise first and foremost Australian household assistance, and they do not excessively compensate big polluters, because frankly that would be, defeat the purpose of the exercise to begin with. And there is research to suggest now that electricity prices are already rising as it is, and that is because of a lack of certainty around a carbon price and a lack of investment, exactly, on renewable energies. There's also, there's also research to suggest that if we don't actually act now, that electricity prices will rise substantially, costing our economy $2 billion. Now, households would not be better off in that circumstance either.
OK, we've got a couple of questions from the floor. Go to this gentleman in the front row here.
All I'll just say is quickly to this notion of putting it out into the community to get feedback. What are we going to give feedback on? We've got this hollow shell of a plan. There's no prices on anything. We don't know what industries are going to be included, what's going to be excluded. What sort of feedback do you want? We've got nothing to say because you haven't said anything. You've just scared the living daylights out of us because we just know that we're going to be taxed, and that's it. And I just will say on one point, Bill, you mentioned earlier, they had to. Yeah, I will. They had to negotiate. Obviously, it was hung Parliament, whatever. Why didn't Julia say at the end of that 17 days, yeah, OK, we've done some negotiations with the Greens now, and we're going to have a carbon tax? She should have said it then and there. Look, I know I said this before the election. Obviously, we just had 7 days. Why didn't she say it then?
Because she's been meeting with the she's had Greg Combet and representatives from the government meeting ever since then on this multi-party climate change committee of MPs, and there are certain talks which have to be taken before she can even say what she's said. I get your frustration. You say...
But all I'll say is, mate...
Hang on, you can't... It's double jeopardy, isn't it? Government rushes in with a giant plan day one, you say, why weren't we consulted on it? On the other hand, the government does what I think is the right thing to do in such a complex and vexed issue. We've outlined what the framework is, and we've outlined a timetable, and then we're going to go and talk to people. But hang on a second. History didn't happen. It's not as if history started on the first day of the second term. The government did advance a whole model for climate change, and we got chopped down in the Senate.
Exactly, that was ditched.
So we're having our next go at it.
OK, all right.
Julia won't give up.
Can I just make this observation, just in response to you? Piers said earlier that in the lead-up to the election, he'd said that a vote for the Greens is a vote for Labor. Now, I disagree with Piers at my peril, but I think he was quite wrong. I think what's been demonstrated is that a vote for Labor was in fact a vote for the Greens. They are running the show.
Yeah. I'll concede that, Malcolm.
OK,
I'll concede that.
Would you made a concession?
Yeah,
all right. Would you mind just holding on for a moment?
I've my neck.
Just hold that thought. I just want to go back to Bill Shorten. We'll move on to different subjects in a moment, but I just want to hear this. You're obviously getting the sense it's going to be quite hard to sell a new tax to the public. Tony Abbott's obviously going to run very strongly on this. You hear from the scepticism in the audience. It's going to be quite a difficult one to sell. How big a risk was this?
I think that as the detail emerges, following talking with people and the work which is underway, I think as more detail emerges, it'll be harder to scare people, which is what the opposition are trying to do. I go back to the basic concept here. Climate change is real. Inaction is going to cost this country more than action. Doing nothing is not an option. The Liberal policy is spend your taxes on subsidising inefficient, carbon-polluting industries with no guarantee that they'll improve. Julia Gillard is putting forward, with Greg Combet and the government, a policy to try and put a price in place, moving towards a market-based system where we reduce carbon. At the end of the day, it mightn't be popular in the first instance, but it's the right thing to do. And I think it'll be a journey whereby at the end of the process, when people actually see what's involved, I think there'll be less frustration.
But Bill, isn't most of our pollution just taking a journey to China and India and Korea and anybody else who buys our coal?
All right, no, you don't get to ask questions through the whole panel. We'll take that as a comment and we'll move along. You're watching Q&A. Go to our website, find out how to join the audience, send a question and watch the program. Our next question comes from Dina Palethorpe.
My question is for Samah. What do you have to say to people like One Nation's Ian Nelson, who just last week said that Muslims are great so long as they assimilate with our culture? In today's society, do you think he represents the general Australian sentiment on this topic?
OK, Samah.
Well, let me just say, for those who charge Australian Muslims with crimes of, not being able to assimilate and being extremists of sort, I would hope that people recognise that the majority of Australian Muslims are not represented by a minority of Muslim extremists. And I would also hope that the majority of conservative Australia is not represented by, representatives like One Nation or, for instance, Scott Morrison or Cory Bernardi's scaremongering campaigns, which only serve to, frankly, create further divisions in our society. I'm more interested in what sort of country we can create where minority groups, where marginalised minority groups can come together and work constructively, where we can all be proud to call Australia home. And I don't think, myths that have been peddled by representatives from One Nation or otherwise do anything to advance our national interest.
Piers Akerman, do you think One Nation's views on Muslims are widely held in Australia?
I'm totally unaware of One Nation's views on anything, Tony. They have no members of Parliament that I'm aware of. They seem to be quoted on the ABC at enormous length, but nowhere else, maybe a little bit in the Fairfax Press. To me...
You obviously missed our program last week, so we can move over that.
They are an irrelevancy as far as they are concerned. I am disturbed, though, when I hear Samah saying that she hopes that young Muslims will feel proud to be Australians, as if Australia is being held up to some sort of a test. I would have thought that all people in Australia have a great affection for this country and for the values that it offers its citizens. I'm disturbed that Samah and her friends, or some of them anyway, may feel that they are totally outside broader Australia.
Well, Piers, it's hard for me and my friends, let's say, to create a sense of belonging and to, strike a connection and affiliation with the Australian identity when we are told time and time again that, frankly, you're not integrating, you have to assimilate to our way and our monocultural existence. Otherwise, leave.
But let me just get this right, Samah. You are an Australian ambassador to the UN, right? Mm-hmm. And yet you don't feel Australian?
No, I absolutely feel Australian, but I'm saying that attitudes, right, that you happen to peddle as well.
You're out there as a pinnacle of our youth, probably in one of the most envied jobs that a young woman can have, and yet you feel uncomfortable about representing Australia.
Absolutely not, and I did not say that.
Okay,
I did not say that. I'm very proud to represent Australia.
Sure. Well, who are these people who are not happy?
If you can please let me finish, right?
Yeah.
There are those who feel as though they are being further alienated and marginalised, right, and targeted. I don't personally feel that way because I have the confidence and the support of my community. I've interacted with many Australians who are proud to actually take a more inclusive approach to our identity, who are proud to commit themselves to multiculturalism.
I'll go to the
I
other
don't know
side.
where you stand on that, though.
No, don't invite a response. Because I'm going to go to the other side of the panel. Gretel.
Well, we are feeling on the other side of the bench here. And I guess I think both of you make completely valid points. Piers, I understand what you're saying. Why is it someone's choice to feel that they are actually not part of a community? I guess my observation is simply the representation of Australia, and congratulations to you as being a UN ambassador. If I can just refer to the most public, other than Oprah, representation we had of Australia was that Australia commercial, the television commercial. There's nothing like Australia. And do you remember the representation of it was because it actually didn't exist? They showed an Australia where there were 3 Aboriginal people, no Asian people, no Muslims, there were no Indians, there were blonde people, and that was about it. So if anything, if I can contribute to this argument, it's in a public representation of Australia. A lot of ethnic diversity is not included, and it must be very hard to feel Australian if you're not represented on television shows, movies, commercials, in many of the media outlets that we normally have. Is that a factor, do you think?
Again, no, I don't want you to ask a question either, because I want to hear from Bill Shorten.
Going back to the original question, which was about One Nation, I don't quite agree with Piers. Well, that doesn't surprise, but I don't quite agree that One Nation hasn't had an influence or doesn't have an influence. I think there's no doubt that in 1996, when Pauline Hanson had her tilt, she did change the bipartisanship which had existed about working through matters to do with immigration and multiculturalism. I do think that in recent times, I don't know what goes on in the Liberal shadow cabinet, but in terms of what the leader of the opposition's parliamentary secretary, Senator Bernardi, said, where he said his problem wasn't with Muslims, it was with Islam. I don't think that was a helpful comment because it's one of the big faiths of the world. Now, I think that what's needed in the debate, and it's the opposite of One Nation, is people come to Australia, they love this country. I don't think because someone wears a scarf or worships in a different way, that makes them less Australian. What I do think is that the debate has gone to the polar extremes. And I think that what the government's been trying to propose, saying multiculturalism's okay, that doesn't mean that people come here and don't adhere to the laws of the land. That's obviously a prerequisite. I just think that we need to have moving attitudes from intolerance to tolerance, and One Nation hasn't been helping that, and they've been a very bad influence in the last 15, 20 years.
Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, look, I think we are the most successful immigrant nation in the world. A third of the people in this city, a third of the people in Australia nearly, were born somewhere else, overseas. We've integrated every culture in the world, and we've done that because we define our national identity by a commitment to a shared set of political values. You don't have to look like anyone in terms of complexion or skin colour or dress to be an Australian. That is one of the greatest things, our greatest strength as a multicultural nation, and that is the policy of my party, and I believe it's the policy of Bill's party, and if One Nation doesn't like it, well, I agree with Piers, they are irrelevant.
OK, we've got a question down the front here.
I'm just wondering, I hope that what you say is very true, Malcolm, but it just worries me that so much in the media, that there's so much vitriol against anyone that supposedly doesn't fit some Australian ideal. Why does that still exist if we're such a successful immigrant nation?
Well, I think some people like to, pour out a bit of vitriol, and there's George Brandis, the Liberal leader in the Senate, wrote a very good piece about this the other day, and he, reminded people of how, when the Irish, a couple of generations ago, the Irish immigrants were all demonised and, accused of being Fenian bomb throwers and so forth. There's every new wave of immigrants gets a little bit of criticism. But having said that, nonetheless, overall, we get on remarkably well. And I think it is absolutely critical that we do not denigrate any faith, any culture, any race, because, they all have great strengths, and we mightn't want to be a Muslim, mightn't want to be a Christian, mightn't want to be a Buddhist or a Jew. That's a matter of choice. But all of those different faiths add to our strength as a diverse nation. I just say this to you. If you look back at history over thousands of years, the most successful societies have been the most open societies, the most diverse societies. When societies have gone backwards, it is because they closed their door to the world. Look at what happened to China. It was the greatest power in the world for thousands of years, and then, 500 years ago, they cut off foreign trade and went downhill and ended up being colonised by the Europeans.
Okay,
and that example that's repeated again and again through history. So openness, diversity, tolerance, the multicultural nation we are, that makes us strong.
OK, we've got a web question. It's come in from... Sean Lawson in Turner in the ACT. Malcolm Turnbull, given the views of people like Scott Morrison and Corey Bernardi, does the Liberal big tent now extend to include racists and bigots?
Well, look, can I say the Liberal big tent does not include racists and it does not include bigots. That's the answer.
Yeah.
Well, that's the question. I've answered it.
And the question
was... Are they in the tent? No, they're not.
But the question was pointing at those two individuals.
Well, they're just having a go at Scott Morrison and Corey Bernardi. I mean, Scott Morrison is a very good guy, a very sincere Christian, a very generous, loving fellow. To describe him as a racist is appalling. Corey Bernardi made a what was clearly an ill-judged remark about Islam, for which he has profusely apologised. You know, let's move on.
All right, stay with us, those people with their hands up, but we're going to go first to a question in the audience from Terry Myers.
My question is to Mr Shorten. Mr Shorten, many Australians, irrespective of their faith, are offended by the decision of the government to donate hundreds of millions of dollars to countries such as Indonesia for the construction of Islamic schools. In this case, why cannot this money, overseas aid, be diverted to help our Anzac cousins in New Zealand following the devastation of their recent earthquake?
OK.
Yeah, that's...
This is a linkage we're hearing quite a bit of. Let's hear from you.
And Terry, when I was up in Ipswich talking to people unhappy with insurance companies, they said the same question. But I gave them in Ipswich the same answer I'm going to give you now. First of all, the government is capable of doing a range of programs at the same time. And in terms of our foreign aid to Indonesian schools, the specific issue which has triggered the debate is that the opposition said don't have the flood levy, instead cut foreign aid to Indonesian schools. And the argument goes that why are we looking after anyone overseas when we should be looking after people at home, or in your case the question is people in New Zealand. First of all, we're going to help the people in New Zealand anyway. Secondly, I think it is wise to help provide funding for schools in Indonesia so that the vacuum of providing education services to our nearest largest neighbour to the north is not filled by more extreme Islamic schools. So if we think that that Indonesia is an important country, which it is, if we think it's good to have our Australian values with Australian foreign aid supporting Indonesian schools rather than money coming from the Middle East into those schools, I think it's actually, not only is it the right thing to do for Indonesian kids, I think it's a good investment in the stability of our nearest neighbourhood, and we will make sure that we fund the flood reconstruction, and we will make sure that we help New Zealanders. This is a country capable of not stopping our foreign relationships as soon as bad things happen at home.
All right, we'll hear from the rest of the panel. Gretel.
Surely also, I'm only guessing here, but isn't there some foreign policy progress that is required for us to give aid to certain countries? I mean, it's not a random ballot, I wouldn't think. It's not a raffle. We choose countries particularly because of our political influence and the doors that opens within the country, doesn't it? So it's not as though we're going to stop giving to Indonesia and give to someone else, because there's a political motivation behind that aid as well, isn't there? Not just largesse and education.
OK, let's hear from Samah.
Well, I think what makes us special as Australians, we're going back to these issues of Australian values and whatnot, is generosity. And we are a prosperous nation. We should be pulling far more weight in our region and offering our neighbours the assistance that they sorely require. Just because we give to Indonesia does not mean that we cannot give to New Zealand, for instance. And this is, you know, the type of development assistance we're providing to Indonesia is a nation-building opportunity for them, and it is, of course, part of, you know, a counter-terrorism framework in which the government is very much committed to. So,
sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
But Samah, I don't think Bill, correct me, nowhere on the madrasa curriculum is there any topic called Australian values that these kids were benefiting of studying, is there?
So, Piers, sorry, can I just interrupt there? Are you actually saying you shouldn't give money to Indonesian schools?
No, but Bill, in his answer earlier on, talked about this reflecting Australian values in Islamic schools in Indonesia. And I don't believe that Australian values is taught as a subject in Islamic schools.
Getting back to the question, though, do you agree with giving the money to Indonesia, to Indonesian schools, or should it in fact go, as the questioner asked, to New Zealand?
No, I don't think you should subtract from one for the other. I'm intrigued that the government has so much money. I thought we were, on our way to running a healthy deficit. But I would certainly be helping our brothers, our cousins, almost everybody I know has got some relationship.
It was about subtracting one from the other.
Without subtracting one from the other. But I do think that the foreign aid budget should be looked at, because I do think there's a lot of waste in there.
Can I just
because the Liberal Party has looked at the foreign aid budget and said they should cut that money to Indonesian schools.
Well, but it's a good... we believe it is a good policy and a good program, but in order to fund the flood reconstruction works without going for the levy, that is something regrettably we would cut back. But it was
do you agree then with the principle that
for foreign aid.
Spend the money at home before you spend it in Indonesia.
No.
That's the principle.
That is not the. Well, that's the principle the gentleman at the back's putting up, and I respectfully disagree with him. I think it is very important that we continue to spend generously, but above all, effectively on foreign aid. You've got to get value and effectiveness for your dollar, and that's much harder than finding the dollars. Let me just say one thing about Islam, though, and Islamic, schools. It was a great mistake to assume that all Islamic schools, are homes for teaching extremism. I mean, that's absurd. I mean, Islam is an ancient religion of great scholarship. I mean, for heaven's sake, much of our learning and culture came to us from the Muslims, just like, our whole system of numbers and much of the learning of the ancient Greeks only survived because of the Arab scholars and the Islamic scholars. So, the idea that Islam is antithetical to learning or culture or scholarship is absurd. Now, it's a great tradition. It is important for us that we promote and encourage Islam and Islamic traditions which are moderate, which support freedom, which support democracy, and which support Australian values, not in the sense of Aussie values, but in the sense of democracy, rule of law, tolerance, freedom. That's what we're talking about. And they are universal values.
Malcolm, do you repeat this in the coalition party room? Because I think it's necessary.
Well, it is a penetrating glimpse of the obvious, Samah. I mean, the idea that you demonise the faith of billions of people with, 1,500 years or thereabouts of history and tradition and scholarship is absurd.
So what was Corey Bernardi thinking when he said it?
Well, he obviously wasn't thinking carefully enough, and that is why he apologised for it, William. All of us are mortal and make mistakes.
OK, you're watching Q&A where you ask the questions. Sometimes the panellists do as well. The next question comes from Malcolm Shivens.
My question is to Bill Shorten and to Malcolm Turnbull. The draft report on disability care and support released by the Productivity Commission today notes that the current system for disability support is underfunded, unfair, fragmented and inefficient, and estimates that an additional $6.3 billion is required to fund the proposed National Disability Insurance Scheme. Will your party support the implementation of the scheme, and how do you propose to fund the cost?
Bill Shorten. We'll just take the politicians on this question, but Bill Shorten first.
The study that you're referring to, just for people's information, is before the last election, the Labor government, after being in government for 2 years, said, listen, the situation facing people with disabilities in Australia and their carers is hopeless. Julia Gillard said on July the 26th that the status quo wasn't good enough. So we commissioned the Productivity Commission. They're a group of independent economists, a statutory body. What is the right way to provide proper care for people with disabilities? The Productivity Commission today, probably overshadowed by some of the debate about carbon pricing, gave a draft report. So it's not its final report. In its draft report, the Commission said, listen, the situation facing people with disabilities and carers is appalling. Any one of you who's a carer, any one of you with an impairment knows that from birth to death and everywhere in between, the system doesn't work adequately. It doesn't take anything away from your accomplishments, but it ain't a good system. So they've proposed that a new system where the Commonwealth basically takes over the field. We say to the state governments that this disability from 0 to 65 would become a Commonwealth issue. They've put a price tag saying it would cost an additional $6.2 billion in 2018. It would take a while to ramp up, sort out what the system looks like. It is a draft report. I was wrapped with the fact that the report's come out today. There is an element of bipartisanship, which is also pleasing. I think the next step will be to see what are the potential savings. What's happened with the politics in Australia at the moment is it gets so dumbed down. As soon as you propose something new, certain people, not on this panel, say it's a great big new tax. And now that isn't happening in this debate, to be fair.
Good.
It isn't happening in this debate, to be fair. But the answer's got to be working out, imagine how rich this country can become if some of these 500,000 full-time carers are able to go to work and earn an income. Imagine how rich this country will become if some of the 1.5 million people with severe or profound disabilities get the chance to participate. Okay. So it's a great start.
Briefly, there's been talk this could be funded, this $6.2 billion, by another levy, a federal government levy, which is effectively a tax. Is that possible?
The Productivity Commission in its draft report said there's several ways to fund it. One is they said take it out of consolidated revenue. That's its preferred mechanism. They acknowledge that one way you can do it is through a levy. Before we get to the debate about taxes, and I know there's some people who are keen to get into every answer now, what I would say is that let's design the system, and that's that consultation process. Disability shouldn't become a political football for the 24-hour news cycle. It's been ignored for too long. This government, and I acknowledge that the opposition's making all the right noises, wants
so
to
you
take
should
it
design
seriously.
the system before you bring in a new tax.
And we should consult first, which is what we're doing.
Isn't that the conversation we had earlier? Turnbull.
No, wait a sec, Tony. Tony, you can't. You just chip in there and make the point, then move on. I'll take that as a comment.
You can make a
all I'd say, very briefly, is, you know, we don't know what the system will look like. We know we've got to have one because the problem's gone on too long.
Very brief response.
Okay.
Is it bipartisan? Do you have a way of raising the $6.2 billion?
Well, I think there are the obvious option is to take it out of consolidated revenue, which is in fact what the Productivity Commission recommended as their best approach. But the most important thing is to recognise that, as they say, the funding of disability services is woefully inadequate. We recognise that. It's been woefully inadequate for quite some time. We made it less inadequate when we were in government. John Howard in particular had a very deep compassion for helping people with disabilities, and particularly those people who are caring for disabled children. It was a very deep passion of his, and one to which he diverted a lot of resources towards. But clearly more needs to be done, and we will do it. We've got the report, we're looking at it, we're approaching it with an open mind, and we'll be, you know, as the policy debate evolves, we will be approaching it generously and compassionately, as I hope the government is too.
OK, almost the first bipartisanship we've seen on this panel, but we've got time for just one more question. It comes from Christopher Zach-Gorick.
My question is to Malcolm Turnbull. In a few years, I'll be eligible to vote, and I want to support a party that can manage the economic affairs of our nation while having a true social conscience. At the moment, I don't see the latter evident in your party's conduct. When will your party truly demonstrate social policies that young people can support?
Well, look, OK, Zach, you should vote for our side of politics because we fundamentally, well, we've demonstrated we're better financial managers than Labor. I think that's pretty clear. But fundamentally, deep down, when you strip away the debate about this policy and that, Zach, we believe that government's role is to enable you to do your best, right? Labor's view is that government is there to tell you what is best, and that's the fundamental difference.
Samah, can I hear you? You can come in. I just want to hear from Samah first.
Well, unfortunately, what we've heard tonight from Malcolm Turnbull is, well, I'm not actually sure. In regards to climate change, though, what is it that you're going to do? Because this is a serious issue for young people. And young Australians. And so I'd really like to know what you're offering to young Australians.
We don't have time for internal interviews,
okay,
but if you want to respond to what the young man is asking. In fact, what did you think about the answer you heard from Malcolm Turnbull? Did it satisfy you?
Yes.
It did. Gretel?
It's a good question, Zach, because I think many of us during this time have looked at the leaders of both parties and wondered how good they really are. And my question, I guess, during this time was in any conflict, whether it's carbon tax or whatever, you want to know what it is you're trying to achieve. What's your goal? And I'm just wondering if both of the parties feel in this week if you've actually achieved what you've been setting out to achieve.
I'll go with Zach's question first. But Zach, how old are you now? 14. OK, my concern is that with the Liberal Party, by the time you're 18, if they still are able to stymie climate change, we'll still be arguing about it. We want to get on with climate change. For yourself, whoever you vote for, I'm sure you'll be right for what you need. In terms of Julia Gillard, we think that the best thing we can do for young people growing up is give them a good education and work on that. That's where we stand.
Piers Akerman.
Well, Zach, I would say you've seen what this government's done in terms of wasting money on the school buildings, in terms of insulation and everything else. I think that take Malcolm's advice and think what you can do for yourself and help your country that way.
Well, I'm afraid that is all we have time for. Please thank Piers Akerman, Samah Hadid, Malcolm Turnbull, Bill Shorten and Gretel Killeen. Okay. Next Monday, a Q&A falls on the eve of the 100th International Women's Day. And we'll be joined by Australia's most powerful businesswoman, Westpac CEO Gail Kelly, the Minister for the Status of Women, Kate Ellis, the Shadow Treasurer, Joe Hockey, the Australians, Janet Albrechtsen, and journalist and commentator Mike Carlton, with your permission, Malcolm.
Two blokes.
And we'll see you again next week. Good night.